I want to quickly mention the story I wrote where in Estonia, this is channelizing the Estonian press, which seem to do a decent job. I think they're called ERR. They hesitate a lot in Estonia. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Here we are in the studio again. We're not sure. We're going to pop out later, aren't we? Because it's my birthday tomorrow, or the day before yesterday when you're listening to this.
Sorry, 49.
49, I know. Don't worry, you don't need to say it. I don't lick it. It's fine. I hear it all the time. You don't need to say it. I hear it all the time. Yes, so we're going to pop out for a couple while we're still allowed, although we're going to have to knock it on the head at 10. Does that include restaurants as well?
I forgot
we
about
want to
that.
get a bite to eat after. I think it includes restaurants.
Any hospitality venue.
Anything fun.
It's good. You'll be in your bed by 11.
Yeah, well, I'll be pleased about it tomorrow.
Most of them actually close at 9:40 because they're so worried about.
I know. Do you remember that last week?
Yeah, but I've been a couple since then. They've also turfed us out at 9:40.
They get really twitchy
because they're so worried the police are going to come around and arrest them if there's even an ounce of alcohol.
It's all got very authoritarian.
Anyway, it does take a few minutes to clear people.
I know, but it's just like when there's normal sort of chucking out time of 11, they're pretty, to coin a phrase, laissez-faire about it. But now they're really uptight.
French.
Whatever French for uptight is, they're that.
What's the French for uptight? What's the opposite to laissez-faire?
Tendu.
That one.
They're a bit tendu.
They're that.
Tight. It's tight.
There we go. Why was I talking about that? Just because here we are in the office
it's
and
your
good
birthday.
for us. And we are going to chat about this week. We're going to start off talking about Nokia. And we move on to Huawei because you've got to. Otherwise, you're not allowed to do Telecoms podcasts anymore. That's part of the Telecoms podcast license, is that you've got to talk about Huawei every week. And we'll finish off talking about OpenRAN, which is not the first time we've covered that either.
No.
But that's just what's going on.
Yeah, OpenRAN valuations, maybe.
You what?
OpenRAN valuations, isn't it?
Okay,
maybe this
OpenRAN
time.
Valuations. Pierre's not going to put valuations on them.
No, it's too long. It's too long a word.
He can't be bothered.
fit it on his little camera screen.
So, sorry for kicking the table though. So that's that. And a couple of things to cover. Firstly, if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify and loads of other platforms. Another thing I want to mention is we've got, like the rest of the world, we're having to, in fact there's been a lot of these going on this week, haven't there? We're having to convert what was a physical event last year into a virtual event, which is called Telecoms.com Live. We had the first ever Telecoms.com Live last year, went really well. Bunch of telecoms luminaries, and we sat up on the stage and we talked some shit and everyone seemed to enjoy it.
It was good.
So, yeah, unfortunately we can't do that in person now because everyone's worried about getting a cold. So we're going to do it virtually, and that's on the 20th of October. So everyone check it out, go on the site. There'll be ads all over the site and stuff, and register and join in. It's not going to be too much to ask. It's going to be 2 sessions, each of about 2 or 3 hours, I think. I should know. I'm not very good at my job, in case you haven't worked it out over the last 6 years. There'll be a couple of pretty short keynotes, like 10 minutes, and then the longer bit is going to be panels. And the first one I'm going to moderate, and Ian's going to be on it. And we're going to be talking about just the state of play of 5G and all that jazz. And we'll have some people who actually know what they're talking about. Yeah,
they
Orange and VRV, and we've got my old mate Phil Kendall from Strategy Analytics involved as well. So it should be a good chat. So that's that plug over. And then before we start, I just got noticed one other thing here. I don't know if it's in camera anywhere, but you seem to have a bottle of what I initially assumed was rosé. What is it?
It is Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, which Pierre has brought in.
Pierre's brought it in for you.
Yeah,
and he's brought it in because we did a whip round for you a little while ago because you were off work for a little bit.
I was, yeah.
And then we thought, let's have a whip round and buy him some stuff so that he feels better, which you clearly do. So it worked.
Yeah,
I missed that whip round.
and Pierre missed the whip round, so he's just went. This is apparently your favourite bourbon, yeah?
Yeah.
Eagle Rare.
Yeah.
So are you going to crack it open?
Yeah, let's open it. Yeah.
Our American audience is like, or they're like, yeah.
Is it? But it is American, yeah. It's not like
yeah, of course.
Not like some Mexican bourbon or something.
Kentucky.
I think we need a
It
knife.
should have a little.
don't we?
Yeah,
Has it
give
got
it
a thing on it?
have a little tab.
You're probably better. Yeah.
I'm probably just got more experience at opening bottles of bourbon than you.
Maybe.
In the meantime, I'm going to give a shout out to our audience in Canberra.
Canberra, I think they pronounce it.
Canberra.
Australia, you're talking about.
I prefer Canberra.
Canberra. I'm fine with Canberra. I just like correcting Pierre
Wearing the pair of
because he sounds so cool when he talks.
Canberra. Australian, whatever.
Okay, we got what? We got a bit of a following there.
This past week, yeah. Ooh.
Have you written a lot of stuff about Australia or something?
No, well, remember last week we had a few people from the Philippines, and that was because of
Very much.
Still this week, actually. Yeah.
one of Mary's stories. Do you want a bit, Pierre?
Mm-hmm.
Can you do it? Do you want me to put it in the middle and then it's easier?
Just got whatever glasses I could get out of the former kitchen. There you go, mate.
And are you normally like this with an ice cube, but...
Yeah, well, there we go. Smells nice. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Clink. Clink. Keep pushing up against the mic here.
That's
nice. I should get my birthday celebrations off to a flyer.
It's a marathon, Scott.
That's
okay?
nice.
I know. When my mates are giving me worried looks later on, you can explain why. Okay, so that's enough dicking about. Let's get on with it. Nokia. I've done all the dicking about I need to do, haven't I, Pierre?
Done all the SoundCloud stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
done
missed
all
that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You just drifted
whittering
off.
on about Telecoms.com's
You
live
just-
thing.
You were just staring lustfully at your bourbon.
hypnotised by the...
That is nice, Pierre. Good call.
It's really nice.
Fair play.
Yeah.
That's a definite step up on your JD
Yeah.
scenario. Do you remember when we did a bottle of JD on the pod years ago?
This is a lot better.
No, we
Yes.
didn't drink the whole thing. We
No.
sipped
Yeah,
it.
some
a
of
little
it.
bit, yeah.
We were swigging out the bottle, I think, then.
That's right, because
This
with
is
that
more
rock
classy
and
we
roll.
got.
Can I do that these days? No.
No, exactly. You might get the plague.
Yeah.
Nokia. Okay, well, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Ian. What's been going on with Nokia?
Well, I think they've had their fortunes have not been great, I think, over the last year. In fact, I think almost exactly 1 year ago now, when they were reporting Q3 results, they sort of alerted everybody to problems in the 5G area, which is pretty significant because mobile access accounts for the bulk of their sales. You know, even though they're an we-do-everything vendor, they're still heavily reliant on mobile RAN. Essentially, that's where all the money is.
Yeah, they're not coining it from the Alcatel-Lucent deal.
Well, I think Alcatel-Lucent gave them some of that, didn't they? And that was one of the issues, that they had to integrate those two businesses, bringing together two big operations.
Again, I'll say again that I'm not very good at my job. I always viewed the Alcatel-Lucent thing as mainly a fixed line.
I think that's the reason they did it, was to get the fixed and the IP and the routing stuff and all that nice stuff that Alcatel-Lucent's been so recognised for. But Alcatel-Lucent also had a mobile access business, and one of the complications was integrating that with Nokia's existing
big M&A,
which is one of the reasons actually that the CFO, who I think is possibly left now, or he's certainly on his way, Christian Pulola, who's been the CFO for a while, is moving on and being replaced. It's a personal decision. But I remember talking to him months ago, and he was saying one of the reasons why things went a bit haywire in the 5G side is because of distraction to do with that integration.
Which is kind of inevitable.
And one of the things they did was, so they made a decision to use these programmable components in the 5G product. They're called field programmable gateways, if I'm getting it right.
That's right, and
that was considered to be a mistake by analysts afterwards. They're quite you can customize them, I think, and fiddle with them after they've been deployed.
Yeah. So thinking about FPGA, which we talked about before, is the field programmable bit. So you've got this sort of core template silicon, but you can adapt it to specific circumstances, which on paper seems like a really good idea, doesn't it?
But they're quite expensive. Everybody else sort of seems to have been going for ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits.
I.e. they're single function.
Yeah, and they're lower cost. So it did show up actually a lot in Nokia's results, that they had this big sort of margin profitability problem.
It was a massive roll of the dice in hindsight.
And that you have to infer from that they were struggling to win business, but just on a pricing perspective. But then there were also suggestions that the products weren't maybe, there are other issues to do with the sort of.
And do you remember they kept getting into partnerships with other chip companies?
They did,
which kind of imply, because about a couple of years ago they were giving it large on their own chip.
Yeah, well
capability.
They've sort of in the last few months. So there's got a guy called Tommy Uito. That's probably not how you pronounce his name, but Tommy Uito's taken over.
Tommy with nice, proper Finnish
he has
name.
been striking deals with people like Marvell and Broadcom and Intel and trying to sort this out, and then they're gradually trying to phase out these FPGAs and move towards system on a chip, I think it's called, isn't it? Stuff that they develop. A lot of the sort of R&D is done in-house.
Yeah, I don't know whether SoC necessarily means FPGA or ASIC, because SoC, I first encountered SoC in the context of phones.
Yeah,
where basically, like one of my first journalistic jobs was a company called Hexus, and their main focus was like geeks who like to make their own PCs from scratch.
Yeah,
and so they would want to read about motherboards and graphics cards and all that sort of business. And so you'd get a motherboard, and it's got slots in it, and a system on a chip was basically like a massively shrunk down version. It's like a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids version of a motherboard. So I don't think it necessarily determines what kind of silicon's on it.
No, but they certainly. I mean, I get the impression they're trying to get out of these expensive components anyway and get into a more
commoditized,
economical,
standardized sort of thing. Yeah.
And so they've got this sort of glide path to when that's going to be completed, and it's quite a long way out before they think they're going to finish doing. I think it's 2022, end of 2022. But whatever's going on that side, there does seem to have been signs of improvements for them. I mean, they'd had quite a long phase when there was a perception, I think they were losing the fight. I mean, I think I even wrote a story saying, is Nokia losing the 5G race? They'd obviously didn't like that very much. And there was a sense that I got a moan, and there was a sense that Ericsson was sort of doing
people have stopped moaning at me.
I haven't. I don't think they have.
No, but I just don't get any moans. I got one moan, which I talked about on the pod last week from Huawei.
You got a moan from Huawei, yeah. I haven't had a moan from Huawei for a while. So.
Right, but I feel a bit of sort of, what's that word?
You need to get moaned at, I think, sometimes. It makes you feel more
FOMO.
relevant. Yeah.
I feel like I'm too irrelevant to moan at.
No, I think the fact that Huawei moaned at you means you're not. But
fair enough.
But they. I mean, I think that for a long time was a perception Ericsson had done a better job on the 5G side, and they'd certainly focused resources on that area. I mean, the whole thing is to try and be a mobile infrastructure vendor. They're much more focused, and they seem to, I think the other thing that's noticeable is that the deals where, you know, Huawei's obviously under a lot of pressure at the moment for geopolitical reasons, and it's got,
I think we might have touched on that.
It's got complications because of what the US is trying to do to it on the supply chain side. So there are governments and service providers in Europe that are kind of now shifting away from Huawei.
Yeah.
And I think for a while there was a sense that Ericsson
will dwell on a bit more in a bit.
Ericsson was sort of picking up all the. I mean, it did a deal with TDC in Denmark. It had deals in Norway with Telia.
And Ericsson's general 5G RAN reputation is higher than Nokia's. So we assume.
And you just sort of felt that Ericsson was sort of poised to do a lot better than Nokia in all of this, and maybe a lot of it will go to Ericsson. Nokia wouldn't do very well at all. And then recently there's been some really good signs, I think, for Nokia. So the main one was probably the BT arrangement that happened 2 weeks ago, was it? Maybe not quite that long
Something
ago.
like that. We've definitely chatted about it on the pod.
It's already a supplier to BT in the RAN, but they sort of renewed that deal and then kind of upgraded what they're doing. So they've taken. I mean, the implication is they're taking some of the footprint that Huawei has. Yeah. They're going to be swapping out some of the Huawei kit.
Certainly
not
up to the more immediate 35% threshold.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're at a third more or less already, but certainly it sounds like they're going to be have a much more significant presence in the BT network, and they're going to be responsible for swapping out some of that Huawei.
The long and short of it is there was business going begging because of the Huawei situation, and Nokia got it.
Nokia got that. Well, I still think BT will probably introduce Ericsson alongside Nokia,
because they're nowhere near totally swapping out.
But it's good for them to have that. You know, we've increased our footprint, and you know, because it shows BT confidence in them, and I think it was
helps them get past the FPGA narrative.
And then I think today, even more significantly, maybe was a deal with Proximus and Orange in Belgium. And they've sort of teamed up on a network. They've got one of those network sharing deals. It's really comprehensive. It's like a sort of full-on build a single network.
All of it,
and we'll both use it. And they had Huawei as the sole supplier of that, according to a couple of people.
Right, so 100% of the RAN.
100% of the RAN, according to Strand Consult, which is an advisory group, and Jefferies, which is a bank.
That's fair enough. That's two solid sources.
And they've basically come along, and you know, they've taken a look at it and said we're going to move to Nokia with 5G. And as part of that deal, Nokia is going to be swapping out all of the 2G, 3G, and 4G stuff that Huawei's provided up to this point by the end of 2023.
Oh God, so that's quite a short time scale as well.
I mean, it's a small country. It's not like swapping it out, I suppose, across the whole of Germany or the US.
But there's still a big capex implication.
Yeah. And I think that is interesting for a couple of reasons because it's quite a speedy swap. There's a lot of resistance, I think, to operators that are using Huawei and don't really want to get rid of it. One of the arguments they always make is it's hard to do in a short time frame, and the more that we see, I mean, it is a small market, but the more you see deals happening where people come along and are able to do it quite quickly and economically, it sort of counters that a bit. It does undermine that argument.
So,
and the other thing is they said they got a really good price. They said that they can actually save money on the deal. Even though there's a swap, I think Proximus
That's surprising, isn't it? Because one of the things, without in any way wanting to diminish Huawei's technical competence, they tended to undercut the market as well.
And I think this sort of is really interesting because it shows that I mean, I don't know the specifics of the tender and exactly what went on in those discussions, but you get the sense, and I think Huawei has tried to sort of position this as very much a sort of commercial arrangement, and there was a tender and they just decided that they preferred somebody else.
All that stuff cracks me up.
But I think there's probably quite a lot of geopolitics involved as well. So they probably made the decision they were not going to use Huawei, and they were going to use either Ericsson or Nokia. But the fact that those two were able to come along and offer something where Proximus has then been able to say we can save 80 million in the next 3 years on capex.
Oh, really? I didn't see that stuff.
What we'd originally planned sounds like there was, they've offered pretty good terms.
So that was the interesting thing I was looking at. So you did a better job of covering it than I did, which is why you know about that 80 million and I didn't. But I was just looking. I quite often look at the canned comments.
Yeah.
Because, my sense is
didn't see one from Ericsson.
There was
because they won the core deal, didn't we? We didn't mention that.
Yeah, there was. I went onto Ericsson's site. They spoke about Proximus, but not Orange.
Right.
And there we are. So this actually proves my point. So with the canned quotes, they're obviously normally quite anodyne. Yeah. I mean, the king of them has always been Qualcomm for me. There's just no point in reading any Qualcomm quote. Quote. There's a tongue twister. Especially when you've had a bit of bourbon. Or perhaps it helps. Because it would just be... Qualcomm's very, very dominated by its lawyers.
Yeah.
So any comment will just go through these battalions of sort of neurotic lawyers who'll strip out anything that might be vaguely contentious or even say a thing.
Foaming in the mouth.
Yeah, exactly. Just thinking about future litigation. They're thinking, what would I do if I wasn't working for Qualcomm? I'd sue they ass.
Yeah.
So, yes, but that's generally also the case with everyone else. But what I try and do is sort of read between the lines. And, for example, the Ericsson comment, where they did a press release about their Proximus deal, and the start of the quote from Aaron Bansal, who's the head of Europe and Latin America, because they grouped the two together for some reason.
Yeah.
Presumably because Aaron wants some air miles or something.
Well, I think one of the reasons is because one of their big customers is Telefonica.
Exactly right. I know that's the real reason. I just chose to be, facetious about it. And he went, the core is really important. Yeah. So his whole quote was, you're going nowhere without a core, son. Yeah. He's getting all,
even though it's
like Xi Jinping, he's getting all Ray Winston about it. He's going, if you don't look at a core, you're a mug, son.
He's got the look, actually, to have that kind of voice, more than I think Xi has.
Okay, fair enough. And so that spoke volumes. But I think we both agree that the RAN work is a lot more valuable than the core work, is that right? I mean, I think you've got a better sense of the money involved.
Well, it's 30 to 35 billion a year, I think, in revenues from the RAN, according to Del Oro. And I think the core...
This is globally?
Globally. I think the core's about 8. I think. I might have that wrong, but I think the core's about 8.
Okay, so we're saying 4
so it's a much bigger,
times bigger
it's a much bigger market. I mean, you're building every base station that you put up is, bigger market is more money.
Because just in terms of units of equipment.
Whereas a core is just, stick software in a few data centers.
I'm surprised the multiple's not even bigger, actually, on that basis.
Maybe I've got that figure wrong, the 8 billion, but I'm pretty... I know the RAM one is 30 to 35.
Yeah. So not only is it a lesser win for Ericsson on that basis, but the fact that they basically were choosing between two people.
Yeah.
For all that, this is the thing I was alluding to earlier with the canned comments. So the canned comments from both Proximus and Orange, as you'd expect, they sort of coordinated their PRs. And it was both like, yeah, this was a totally meritocratic tender, and it's all about technology and value for money. And it's like, oh, fuck off.
Yeah.
You know, clearly politics and security played a role. In fact, you had a quote towards the end of yours where you'd interviewed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the guy who's now the CTO actually of Orange is called Michael Trabia. It's probably not pronounced Michael Trabia, but yeah. He used to be CEO of Orange Belgium. When I met him in January, back just before lockdown, more or less, at one of the last events I went to, he was there, and I remember I think grabbed a coffee with him, and had a chat with him on the sidelines, and he was saying, you know, one of the big concerns about Huawei at the moment is that they could basically like cripple infrastructure. It's not necessarily to do with spying; it's that there's a worry within circles that, you know, government circles perhaps, that they could cripple infrastructure. So he was CEO of Orange Belgium.
We're going to drill down a bit more into that when we get into
was clearly
UK
sort of
stuff.
Thinking that was on his mind. So you know, this
so
clearly has been an issue.
Security's there, and then, you know, we all know that Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State's been doing yet another tour of Europe.
Yeah. Basically,
the whole point of the tour is to hassle everyone into shunning Huawei. So it's happened in Italy, it's happened in Greece.
Yeah.
And anyone who's already done it, like the UK, gets a little pat on the back from the Americans.
I think the other interesting thing about, which wasn't my point, but John Strand of Strand Consult, who I spoke to on the phone this morning, was saying it's interesting because Belgium is where NATO's headquartered, and it's where the EU has obviously a lot of its buildings and everything.
Brussels.
So you had the interesting thing is, if you look at the Belgian market in terms of the 3 mobile networks that are there, they've according to Strand's data, they've all been totally dependent on Chinese network products for the last few years.
Yeah, well, you say so. There's an interesting one. Is the other one called Telenet?
Telenet, which is a Liberty Global subsidiary,
right.
Is 100% ZTE.
Right, that's a bit weird, isn't it? You don't get a lot of
but it
ZTE
makes sense to me
Europe.
because I did meet Telenet at a ZTE event in Italy a couple of years ago.
Were you there,
Pierre?
Pierre?
Exactly.
No.
And I didn't talk about the specifics of what they bought and how much they had, but they were obviously there as a big ZTE customer, you know, one of their sort of flagship European customers. And John Strand, you know, the data they've sort of looked into and researched, they're saying that they're 100% ZTE. So they're totally so basically all NATO's and any kind of organisation that is using mobile comms in Belgium is going over Chinese networks.
China, who are out of favour at the moment. I'll tell you another thing about that Telenet situation. So I went and checked out some Omdia data and reminded myself that Telenet is that has got the least subscribers of the 3 in Belgium. And yet they're not part of this network sharing deal. I mean, that looks like a bullshit in terms of competition.
Yeah,
that looks like a bullshit
in Belgium,
arrangement.
where it's a sort of, you know, cockpit of all the political stuff.
So I mean, I looked at, and we covered it back in March, that this network sharing joint venture was being scrutinised, but they clearly gave it the green light.
Yeah.
And it's like, how can you have the 2 biggest ones network share and not have the third one involved?
And the
it's
thing
ridiculous.
I don't understand is the inconsistency, because I think in the Czech Republic plans for something similar have been really controversial, haven't they? They've sort of, I haven't quite tracked
Was that the thing that the Vodafone guy was moaning about?
There's one that was Italy, where that's a fibre thing, I think, in Italy. But there's a
But
network.
he moaned about Czech and Portugal at the same time.
Oh, he did. You're right. Yeah. Sorry, you're right. Yeah.
But anyway, yes, it just seems odd. I don't see how they could allow it. It clearly puts Telenet at a further competitive disadvantage.
Yeah.
And who can blame it for going with a Chinese vendor who, let's say for the sake of argument, is cheaper?
But I guess it'd be interesting to see what Telenet does, because, you know, if it is political, and there were some moves made, I think, that were reported on by Politico in June about Belgian security laws and doing similar things to what the UK proposed in January. You know, like we can't have Chinese vendors in the core, but which I'm not sure they did anyway. It's a bit unclear whether Ericsson's actually picked up work at Huawei's expense or whether it was actually already there.
Yeah, my interpretation, reading between the lines, is it was kind of already there. Yeah,
at least in one case, because they probably have separate core networks. They tend to have separate cores, don't they? But they share the RAN. So
again, reading between the lines with some of the canned quotes and the PR commentary, there was nothing that led me to believe this wasn't a sort of evolution of an existing core.
Yeah. But these rules that Belgium was talking about back in July time were very similar to the stuff that the UK was discussing, which is to have no high risk vendors is the term that gets used to describe the Chinese.
That's the euphemism, isn't it?
Yeah, in the core at all, and then you cap 35% in the RAN. So almost exactly the same as what we proposed in January actually here.
So to go full circle on the Nokia theme, I think it's fair to say that Nokia's on a bit of a good run at the moment.
It's on a good. I mean, they've got a lot of. When we talked about this before we came on, they've got a lot of announcements going out at the moment about bitty things and various deals and
little bits and bobs.
I think things like
things
this,
are strategically significant.
BT's significant because it's a massive operator. It's an incumbent in one of the world's biggest economies, saying we trust you to pick up some work at the expense of our formerly, sort of main supplier, which is not going to be in the future, but the people we've relied on for years, which is like a real vote of confidence. And then I think the fact that they've won this work in Belgium shows that they can beat Ericsson basically in a tender.
Yeah, which actually in the short space of time, I mean, over the summer, I think both you and I, we didn't figure that Ericsson was going to win all the 5G RAN deals, but we figured it as probably the front runner in most of them.
Yeah,
and now suddenly. It looks losing.
More level. Yeah.
Like most of the ones that have come along, I can't think of the last big one.
No,
off the top of my head, there probably was one. We'll have Sonny on the phone going, Scott.
I mean, it's not all been great news for Nokia, because I remember just before all this, before the BT deal, actually they had that big setback in the US where I think it's Verizon went with Samsung.
Right. And for Verizon not to go with Ericsson is saying something.
Well, Verizon went with I think they've kept Ericsson, but they didn't go with Nokia.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry,
so I think Nokia.
I was about to say, because for those few people listening who won't be immediately aware, Verizon's run by the former CEO of Ericsson.
No, that's going to continue, but I think they took Nokia out and have introduced Samsung as their other sort of main mobile RAN vendor. So that was and that was. I remember, I think I covered it, or perhaps Mike did, I can't even remember now, but I remember Light Reading did write about it, and that was perceived to be a really big setback for Nokia, because that's a massive market, obviously, and worth much more than a deal in Belgium. So it's not all been plain sailing, and it'd be interesting to see what they've got to say about it when they report, actually, in Q3 in a couple of weeks' time.
They're looking right in Western Europe. Obviously,
they're looking good in Western Europe.
They sort of perpetuated their one. Is it Elisa, the Finnish one? But you sort of expect that, don't you?
I mean, I think the two of them are just in a really good position at the moment in Western Europe, and maybe not just Western Europe, maybe sort of a lot of Eastern Europe as well. I think Huawei's finished in the region is my prediction, and I just think all that work, because it's too early, I think, for OpenRAN. And there no one, even in 5 years' time. Well, I know we're going to talk about this later, so not spend too long talking about it now.
Well, you're sort of preempting both.
I am, but
so thanks.
I'll leave that stuff alone. But I think for the next few years, certainly, I think those two companies, Ericsson and Nokia, are just poised to do really well in Europe. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to move on to Huawei, but first I've got to move it on and go around the corner for a sec. So what I'm going to propose is that you and Pierre, I saw a little thing, not that you can't talk about the proper telecoms-y stuff, but I know you're more interested in the device-y stuff. I think in later this month, I think Apple's finally going to launch its sort of 5G phone. And I
talk about your new Pixel phone.
And I've just bought a new Pixel. Well, no, I've got to go off, and I'm just thinking, how can we fill dead air while I go off? And you can tell Ian whether or not you're going to buy the 5G iPhone.
Okay.
I'll be back in a sec.
Yeah.
The main thing about the Pixel 5 that I want to talk about is that it's in here $699.
$699.
Yeah, which is
this is the Google phone.
Yeah.
Right.
The flagship one.
Yeah.
Which is surprising, because the flagship one from Apple is $1,000, if not more.
Yeah. And this is a follow-up to the. I mean, they've already got the Pixel range, have they?
Google? Yeah. It's just they had the 4 last year, and this is the 5. This is the 5G one, which for them it falls perfectly. It's Pixel 5, 5G.
And would you buy one?
A Pixel?
Yeah.
No.
You're too much of an Apple fanboy.
Yeah, I'm too locked in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
My wife has one.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have both. It's got probably the best camera
And are they considered? Is the Pixel range considered to be sort of at the forefront of what's coming out of Android at the moment, or because Samsung's the big player, isn't it? There
I
still,
say
really?
Samsung is. I mean, that's the thing. It's $699, but there's a reason why. I mean, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles.
So, what would you pay for a top of the range Samsung? You're paying sort of Apple type prices for that, or
yeah. I mean, I'll see what the iPhone 12 is like, but I have a 10.
Yeah.
It's still perfect. I don't know. My wife has an 8, so I'm thinking, do I give her my 10 and we give the 8 back to Apple and
the
discount?
12's interesting because this is going to be a 5G compatible one as well, and this is due to come out imminently. Or, because there were worries it was going to be delayed.
I think it's delayed, but only for a couple of weeks.
Right. And is there an expectation that a lot of people are going to sort of upgrade to that, and it provides a bit of a spur to 5G?
Didn't you talk about this last week? Like when
we probably did.
When Apple releases a 5G phone, it's going to
this is what people are hoping is going to be a big catalyst, I suppose, for the market, isn't it? But we had a little segue while you did your around the corner thing.
Did you buy the 5G or the A?
I bought the Pixel 5, the actual 5.
$699, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I was saying, is surprisingly much cheaper than the
Well,
other
that's
ones.
why I bought it. I mean, I've got a 3. So this fellow here.
3A or 3?
No, this is just a normal 3.
Yeah.
Look at that. It's on the podcast page. How cool is that?
Yeah.
And probably some abusive message from one of my friends as well.
Is that me? Is that a terrible picture of...
No, that's me sipping from a tin. Although, I don't know why... Oh, that's you. That was a good one of you. You're smiling. You look happy. It's not like you.
I'm always smiling. I'm just giggling like an idiot on the photos.
So yes, I thought, let's just go for it. When you consider that a flagship Samsung, let alone Apple, you're looking at a grand plus.
Yeah.
I thought, sort of £300 less.
Well, we were just wondering what impact the 12 is going to have on 5G.
This is the iPhone.
The iPhone 12.
So it's sort of chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean, lots of people buy it. There's an install base of Apple people that are just going to refresh every year or two.
I feel it's just like iOS is the other half of the ecosystem that hasn't been on 5G yet. And now there will be. I mean, not all of them.
The question is, does it matter? And what is the iOS ecosystem missing by not? I got another little shout out.
Like population.
Yes. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm just wondering what the implications are. So I was having I got a text message from a Telecoms.com podcast veteran, Mary Clark, who's currently between jobs, and your helmet fell over. Yeah. Sorry, I'm English. I can't say helmet without giggling.
It's an actual helmet.
Let alone Ian, who's now inconsolable. And Mary got in touch, and she was actually saying, what does she say? She's saying she enjoyed the last podcast. She goes, I love the "it's one better in it" bit. Apparently, she laughed out loud. Anyway, and I was having a little chat with her, and I was going, what should we talk about? And she goes, well, you should talk a little bit about 5G applications. Now, to some extent, she would say that because that's her sort of core area of expertise, but that doesn't mean she hasn't got a point. And that's what you said made me think of that, Pierre, because iOS, as you quite rightly say, Apple's about a hell of a lot more than just the devices. The devices are good, but there are devices of equivalent quality in the Android ecosystem. But what they don't have, of course, is iOS. And there are certain things, like I was listening to a Rogan podcast recently. He's talking about Air something. There's basically an easy way of transferring files.
AirDrop.
Yeah. And how much better that is than anything there is on Android.
Because
and I thought,
it's a closed system.
Quite.
Yeah.
But then I thought, what maybe is the iOS ecosystem missing for not being on 5G? And I'm still not convinced. And I think Mary, if she was here, might concede that.
That's the problem with 5G, though, isn't it? That's not an Apple problem, that we still don't have any applications really that need 5G. It's like Uber. It wouldn't work on 3G very well, Uber, would it? It'd be crap.
No.
But,
my point is that you have all these 5G networks, let's say in England, and then the only people on those networks are people using the few selected Android phones. And now soon, you'll have in terms of network iPhone 12 people.
Yeah. So in terms of network load and stress, you're right. That'll be there, and it'll just maybe it'll bring to a head how shit 5G coverage is.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to
It
get
is
better,
generally,
though, I
isn't it?
suppose, isn't it? And I guess the phones they're dual mode, aren't they? It's not just a 5G phone. It's going to fall back on 4G when it's not in 5G coverage. So, bloody hell, we're going for it.
Well, I finished mine. You're all right, are you, Pierre? Anyway, so that was just a segue that I had so that I could go and have a slash.
I totally forgot what we were talking about before now.
Okay, well, it's all right. I'm supposed to be running this gig. So we're talking about how Nokia has won this we're getting rid of Huawei business in Belgium, as it has with BT. And then there was some other Huawei stuff. Two things really interested me this week. One you wrote about, and one I don't think you did. So we'll talk about the one you wrote about too, which is this Defence Committee report that came out yesterday or the day before, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Where basically they did a pretty big old study, like usual sort of public sector thing of hundreds of pages.
Well, yeah, it was long.
Long, yes. So how exhaustive it is, I suspect you're going to push back on with some reason. But it was long. And it was looking at the current state of play with Huawei, i.e. 35% by whenever. When is it?
January 23, I think.
Okay, so 35% by 23 and then 0% by 28.
Yep.
It's more or less it. Well, actually, it's the end of 28, I think.
End of 27.
End of 27, by 28.
A lot of people say by 27,
that
which
is
implies
it.
January
Yeah, because I
27,
remember
which it
I
isn't.
got quite pedantic about it at the time and felt like I was one of the few people actually calling it properly.
Yes, yeah.
And anyway, so they said, okay, that's all fine as it is, but what if? And then there were a bunch of sort of hypothetical type of situations that basically amounted to, the way I characterised it is, what if the Chinese start getting a bit more cheeky?
Yeah.
Because they were saying that the Chinese have been sort of explicitly and covertly...
Covertly and overtly.
Sorry, yeah. They were both the verts.
Yeah.
Covertly and overtly threatening.
Yeah.
And there was things like, I don't know if this latest new nuclear power station, Hinkley Point or whatever, is going to be made by Chinese, but things like them
apparently
threatening...
involved in HS2 as well, which is that crappy plan for a
So the Chinese are
line.
obviously good at infrastructure, full stop, whether it's telecoms or rail or power or whatever. And we've gotten involved probably for similar reasons, i.e. a combination of price and competence.
Yeah, well, this all stems back to that David Cameron phase, doesn't it? When they came over, and I remember the BBC sitting there saying, "Why should the British people be happy about Chinese companies coming and doing this work?" And they're pretty valid questions at the time.
But valid answers that they're good at it, and they
Well, they don't ask half as decent
Although I was reading
questions
something
nowadays,
in the Spectator. Apparently, the deal that George Osborne did for this Hinkley Point C thing, it was a bit of a skank.
Right.
I don't think it was good deal for, according to the...
Well, the HS2 is a disaster budget-wise, isn't it? It's sort of 100 billion projection, I think.
So the argument that, and I'm not saying it's the fault of the Chinese people that we got ripped off. It's just that our politicians are shit negotiators.
Yeah.
But
the point is, we were all sort of the Cameron phase is all about welcoming China and trying to build bridges and have them come in and do
same
stuff.
as the Obama phase.
There was a shot of Cameron and Xi Jinping in a pub.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was all very cosy and
Xi
jolly
Jinping in a pub. How incongruous is that?
Who would have known? I mean,
for all we know, he's a complete waster. He might just when he's not, plotting.
But maybe that's why you want to be a sort of leader forever, so that you can be a waster. Just get it sorted, and then you can sort of kick back and watch your big flat screen TV and eat cheeseburgers on the bed, and
I somehow doubt it. He doesn't. I can't imagine him letting his hair down. But who knows? I don't know the guy.
Yeah,
never met him.
Probably never will.
Unlikely. In fact,
you never know.
On the back of this pod and my reporting, I think I'm unlikely to ever go to China, to be honest. I wouldn't fancy my chances. There'll be a file on me somewhere, I reckon. So, I'll give that a miss. I went once. That was fine.
Yeah.
So there was this report, and so they were saying, China's been threatening us, and if they keep that shit up, then maybe we'll just ramp up. And then...
Turf out Huawei earlier than planned.
Turf out Huawei by like 25 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, they're going, however, the sooner we do it, the more problematic it is for our operators. And that's back to the thing you were mentioning earlier about, especially the likes of BT, I think, going on about our price. And Vodafone as well.
Yeah, I'm probably being a bit facetious there. I mean, I'm not saying that it obviously has an impact to take out someone's... The problem is that they've... it's not just about taking out 5G, which possibly isn't that widely installed at the moment. I mean, they've only just started out building 5G
it's the
networks.
retrofitting.
It's the fact you have to retrofit a lot of other stuff because of interdependency between the different systems. So what it means is they end up having to take out, because they've actually run all their radio stuff. I didn't realise this actually until not that long ago, but this single RAN concept, which means you put everything on one platform, so 2G, 3G and 4G, means you're not even just getting rid of 4G, you're getting rid of all your radio stuff,
the
basically.
legacy.
And what that means, for a start, you need a vendor that can actually support those old technologies.
Which is why
it sort of rules out
Samsung's not
Samsung
involved,
because they don't do any 2G and 3G.
And that was the purpose behind that sort of Mavenir
and you
acquisition.
don't have, exactly, so Mavenir, until they bought IP
access.
Access recently, didn't have any 2G and 3G stuff. So it
And now
rules
they're
out a lot of
IPOing.
players. Now
They
they're
didn't waste
IPO.
any time, did they?
Yeah. Interesting times for them, and see what happens with them in the UK, I suppose. But yeah, it is a big shake-up for the operators to have to do that job and retrofit everything, as you say. And there's one extreme end of the argument that says it's going to cost billions, it's going to lead to we're all going to have to go and live in log cabins and start eating each other again. And then there's the opposite end where people say, more sort of John Strand's line, I guess, not being unfair to John, but
Do you think he listens to this? We mention him nearly every week.
I think he listens to it. Yeah. I think he's more on the argument that it's been grossly exaggerated, the cost, and everybody's making it out.
So part of the
cost,
not
really a hassle at all.
Part of the cost calculation is to do with depreciation and obsolescence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to naturally swap out radio kit every however often.
Well, I think it's. I mean, I don't even know how long that is, but certainly the generations of technology seems to almost be getting quicker. I think 4G was launched in the UK in 2012, I think. 2012 EU
and now
launched.
we're like 2010.
And we launched it last year, yeah. It was 2019, was it first launched? So 7 years. I mean,
so it used to be like a 10-year cadence, and now it's narrowing.
7 or 8, I would say now. So this is the interesting thing. The government deadline of 27, 28 is round about the time when, if things go as you expect, they'd be talking about launching 6G and planning a big swap out, and maybe they're going to have another swap before then anyway. I don't know, to do upgrades, but the point is you do have to replace stuff. So if you give people long enough to depreciate then
there's no cost to them because they've got to replace it anyway.
Whereas if you ask them to do it in a year, then you're going to, and especially if they've just had an upgrade, then it's going to cost them. And I think one of the differences between BT and Vodafone is that I think Vodafone hasn't depreciated as much equipment, so they're more worried about having to do a quick swap, because they've only just done some upgrades. Right,
so basically their accounting, their balance sheet would have said...
Whereas I think BT's more at the stage where perhaps it's not quite as bad.
They were getting there anyway.
Yeah, and interestingly, they said when they were told they had to conform with this 35% cap, their estimate for the extra cost on top of what they normally expect to spend was about 500 million. And then when it's 28... And then when they said you have to get rid of everything by 2028, they were
like, no worries.
Oh, it's still 500 million, because it's such a long period of time. They can basically write everything off over that period of time anyway. So
yes. So there was that angle, which they were quite rightly looking into. But the tone of this Defence Committee report was very much in keeping with the broader political tone, and actually more in keeping with the general political feeling of the time that we have right now with coronavirus, which is economics plays second fiddle to safety.
Yeah.
That's basically the long and short of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so with coronavirus, with like, look, pubs just going to have to go out of business because we can't have people getting a cold.
Yeah.
And with 5G, it's just like, well, the operators are going to have to take the hit because we can't expose ourselves.
Or I wonder whether the report authors, because these were the guys, I remember some of the named people on this defence committee whose names are at the top of the report. I remember
11
them
MPs.
all. I remember being on the same webinar or whatever you want to call it. They had the same online session as them when they were going through all these grilling sessions in the summer, and they were asking BT and Vodafone about how difficult it was to do this. I wonder if there's a bit of scepticism that's crept in, because immediately after they came out with the rules, BT immediately said, oh, actually, we can still do it for 500 million. And Vodafone's been very, very quiet. It's not sort of made a panicky, oh, this is going to like really affect UK forecasts for the next few years and it's terribly disruptive. So maybe they've thought, maybe we're a little bit too generous.
Well,
we could have
another
had
interesting thing, which I'll invite you to comment on, is like the footnotes and the sources. So I'll make
reading a few of them.
Yeah, and Strandy gets a mensch.
Yeah.
But I think you were mentioning it maybe before we started recording. So you and I think both went our headline was they might accelerate the whole process.
Yeah.
But a lot of other media went with the headline where there was one paragraph where they basically said there's definitely a link between Huawei and the Chinese state.
And then they didn't really show that there was definitely
and they said a provable link.
Yeah.
But then, you take up the narrative.
I mean, I remember reading that and thinking, wow, that's like, you put something like that in when you've got some firm, a smoking gun, as they call it, and some bit of evidence that really is like, oh, wow, this is shocking, and it's going to change the whole conversation about Huawei permanently in Europe even. So I remember going through it, and there's nothing at all. It's all...
links to the press, isn't it?
Links to Telegraph
links
articles.
Links to bloody journalists.
FT articles and journalists. Which is not really... I mean, you'd expect these guys to have their own sort of research departments and go out, or maybe they've spoken to people who know about it. But it's all
They're just reliant on the goddamn media.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not going to be all self-effacing or too self-effacing as a journalist, but I do know that the media on the whole is incredibly under-resourced these days compared to even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's kind of shocking.
Well, I mean, the things that they were linking to, it wasn't like even a Reuters report where they've been given a file that has then been presented in court during the case. It was sort of
some random report.
Telegraph journalist has dinner with someone who says, "Oh yeah, the Chinese are going to do this."
I was a bit upset neither of us cropped up, if I'm honest.
They
Seeing
always
as their standards are so low,
though, don't they? But it's always going to be the Telegraph and the FT, mate. You know that.
So that was bizarre, and.
It wasn't a very... I didn't feel it was the sort of rigour that you'd expect of a Defence Committee report. And maybe all government... I don't spend a lot of time looking through government reports unless they're specifically to do with telecom.
Yeah.
So maybe this is just a common feature of government reports.
Be a bit worried about you.
They're a bit shit.
I think they're just a bit speculative. So again, if you think of a coronavirus thing they did recently where they were talking about sort of speculating about locking down a bit more. And they got these two guys, Whitty and Valance, and they got a really simple chart where they basically extrapolated on the basis of coronavirus cases doubling every week. And they go, if that happens, and then obviously an exponential curve. That's what an exponential curve is. And everyone was like, well, yeah, but where's the evidence that's going to happen?
Did it, as Boris Johnson would say.
But it just sort of, it just sort of went up, and they put that out there with all sorts of caveats, like it probably won't happen, but what if?
Yeah.
And of course our pathetic media all just ran with it and just went, oh my God, we're all going to die. And so the reason I'm mentioning it is I think that was deliberate. I think they pick a data point or a chart or an extrapolation to lead with because they know the press is so unrigorous. And so, and I don't blame all the media for this because they're very under-resourced. So you've probably got one bloke writing every story in the Telegraph, having to write about 400 stories a day, or woman, I should stress, or something else.
Well, I think they're less under-resourced than we are. I mean, they do have research assistants and people like that still at these big newspapers. They don't make any money, but they're all
maybe I'm just trying to give them an excuse for writing such shite stories. Anyway, but the point is, I think maybe the government sometimes does lead with this spurious stuff because they know that not many people are going to read the whole report. Actually, I missed that paragraph on the provable link with the state, even though they didn't prove it, because I was time limited and I was turning around the story in a couple of hours. Yeah. So, I'm not innocent of it.
Yeah.
But anyway, the whole thing just read like a let's be even more hawkish on Huawei than we already are. Yeah. Was the long and short of it for me.
Yeah.
Same with you?
Yeah, definitely. And they've made up their minds, haven't they, basically? They've made up their minds. And I think, there were obviously parts of not the government necessarily, but there were some politicians who obviously wanted a much more rigorous clampdown, I think, than we saw. There's people in the House of Commons who are, what's his name?
Tugendhat.
I mean, he's probably the sort of person who thinks that they should be getting banned next year.
Yeah, he's one of these ex-forces types that just gets all chest thrusty about it.
They call it task force, yeah?
Oh, they've appointed a task force to try and find alternatives.
So they were given a task and they're like, see how quickly we can get there.
Yeah. Exactly. No, that's definitely the direction of travel. And then the Belgium thing. And actually, before we move on to the last segment, I want to quickly mention the story I wrote where in Estonia, this is journalising the Estonian press, which seem to do a decent job. Mm-hmm. I think they're called ERR. They hesitate a lot in Estonia. Basically, Huawei's thinking of taking Estonia to court for banning it, along the same lines as everyone else. Yeah. Along the same lines as everyone else, which is, well, they're a bit dodgy and Chinese.
Yeah.
Which is the long and short of basically policy towards Huawei, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the grounds that it violates European Union equality law, which says that you can't discriminate against someone on the basis of their nationality or ethnicity.
Well, they're not doing it on that basis. They're doing it because they've got links to the government.
Well, quite. But they're going to allege that it's done on racist or xenophobic. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting. The two reasons I found it was interesting. So I agree with you. Estonia will presumably argue back. It's got nothing to do with that. We like Chinese people as much as the next bloke. We just think you're dodgy.
Yeah.
But I think Huawei also has a point, because the basis on which people are assuming Huawei is dodgy is because they're Chinese. Now, it's not their ethnicity. It's definitely not racist.
No.
It's because they're presumed to have links to the Chinese state. So it's political rather than ethnic or national. But I can see why they might give that a go. And I just thought it was interesting that they're trying it at all. They're presumably trying it in Estonia because their lawyers have had a look at the legal system there and thought maybe that gives them their best chance of winning. But they could have tried it in the UK, they could have tried it in France, they could have tried it in
I mean, it sounds weird to
Belgium.
me that you can take a government to court for not using your products in its country.
Well, because of the European Union. There's
right.
you know we had this little kerfuffle about the UK breaking international law.
Yeah.
You know, there is such a thing as international law, and international law, when you're part of an international bloc, takes on more weight. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that because we're running out of time. But I thought it was an interesting thing. Firstly, that Huawei's trying it.
Yeah.
Secondly, that they're trying it in Estonia rather than anywhere else. And thirdly, I don't think they'll win. Mainly because France and Germany have already done a similar thing to Estonia, and France and Germany basically run the EU.
Well, the EU is still planning its own sort of. I mean, they always seem to take some ages to churn something out, but they'll have some updated thing about high risk vendors and what the next plan is for them, won't they? Huawei's finished in Europe.
Yeah,
that's my prediction.
No, totally. And this Estonia thing isn't going to change that, but I just think it's an interesting sort of legal. Moment.
Network side of things. I don't know about handsets. I don't know enough about it.
Well, that's back to conversations we had about chipsets and all that. So anyway, we're running out of time. So I'm going to move on. One thing, just to sort of spontaneously generate a segue. In that Defence Committee report, there was quite a lot of real estate put to OpenRAN.
Mm-hmm.
Because
it was mentioned dozens of times. Actually.
It was mentioned dozens of times, and it's just become, for people who don't really, well, not even necessarily for people who don't know what they're talking about, but for people who are just looking for a simple narrative. You know, the obvious thing, if you go, right, let's ban Huawei, the obvious rebuttal is, all right, in favour of what?
Yeah.
And obviously the simple answer is in favour of Nokia and Ericsson.
This brings us back to our opening.
Yeah, and then people go, okay, duopoly, oh, that's great. Yeah. So the answer to the duopoly question is OpenRAN. Mm. So that's my segue. Not bad.
It's a good segue.
And I'm going to hand it over to you because specifically the sort of newsy angle on OpenRAN was at least in part this sort of tip thing that happened this week, which I know you covered and you listened in.
Yeah, which I didn't think was... I mean, online events, you know, they're a bit...
Careful.
Hard to get enthusiastic about them, isn't it?
Don't get sacked, son.
And I think we've only actually just entered online event season because we've had this summer layoff when there isn't normally any online events anyway. And now we're seeing all this stuff we normally go to, like TIP and the Broadband World Forums, all going online. And
Telecoms.com Live.
Telecoms.com Live is obviously the exception to the rule.
Yeah, that's going to be brilliant.
But all the others are a little bit, I don't know. I mean, some of them have actually done a good, you know, they're doing the best they can. Obviously, everybody is. But I didn't find the TIP one didn't seem to have... I remember going to that event in their summit in November in Amsterdam, and they had loads of really good presentations, and it's good to meet people. And there's loads of updates, and I found this one a bit, and maybe it's just because it was online that you didn't get sense of.
It's hard. I mean, TM Forum had the same challenge this week.
Yeah, it's really hard to get enthusiastic. I think about you know, you don't see it on a stage with all the glitz and then the free drinks afterwards, and it doesn't quite have the same impact, but. There was one fairly significant announcement from Vodafone on its sort of selection process for OpenRAN companies that could come along and participate in its networks in the future. And it's been making a big deal about, potentially using OpenRAN across a lot of its European mobile sites. And
what was that project that was first talked about at the start of the...
Evenstar, you mean?
There we are.
So Evenstar is this project to try and come up with an OpenRAN radio that costs less than $1,000.
That's it.
Which would
so
be really
I had a certain
apparently.
Vodafone PR person who shall remain nameless get in touch about that.
Yes, well, so did I as well.
Okay.
So their sort of network strategy guy is called Santiago Tenorio, and he's a
Cool
good guy.
name.
He's very good, cool name, and he's quite engaging.
I've got a nephew called Santiago.
And even better. And he's
And I was born in Santiago, in
Yeah.
Chile.
That's good.
brings
Sorry.
it all together.
Yeah, we are.
And he's been harping on about OpenRAN for a long time. He's a sort of quite an evangelist, and he's obviously been leading a lot of the stuff they've been doing. So one of the programs is Evenstar, try and get this radio that's less than $1,000, and that seems to be moving really well. It's they now have this radio that works in the 1800 megahertz band, I think, and it's not state of the art, super duper sort of massive MIMO, but it's
grand.
a fit for purpose grand.
Yeah.
They've
And
basically
my
named a
understanding is,
bunch
I
of
don't know
vendors.
what we're comparing a grand to, but
Well, I don't either, but I think most radios
A
are
lot.
like significantly more than that. You're talking
10
more than 10.
more
even,
than
I
10
think,
times
yeah.
more than that.
I think it depends on the capability of the
Okay.
radio, but it can be sort of up to quite a lot. But they named a bunch of hardware vendors that they thought they sort of called out the front runners on the hardware side for for people that could it's ready to deploy almost, companies that are going to have equipment that's ready to be used either early next year or mid next year, and some of it even now. And they sort of had this list that we published. So that was interesting, not just because they've sort of called out a few companies, but there were actually quite a lot of them. It's good to see some momentum happening there, I guess. And
Yeah, and TIP, it's easy to forget that TIP has been pushing OpenRAN for a while.
it's been pushing up around. Obviously, you want to see concrete stuff going on.
Yeah.
I mean, the underwhelming side to me slightly is that about a year ago, Tenorio got up on stage and made this big deal about we're putting the whole RAN footprint up for tender. It's an opportunity for OpenRAN companies to come along and win deals. And the results were supposed to be by April, May, this year. And obviously none of that's happened. Now we've had all sorts of crap going on this year, which has probably changed things a lot.
Have we?
Just a bit.
And not just coronavirus. I mean, even on the geopolitics side,
Yes.
there's been all sorts of disruption. But it's good to see companies being called out, and there is stuff going on. The thing is that you're talking about the duopoly, the Nokia Ericsson duopoly. That is what's going to happen, though.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, of course. I mean, what else?
I mean, OpenRAN is.
If we're not allowed
if you-
Chinese vendors, that's all that's left.
If you look at forecasts by
Samsung, fair enough.
well, there's the problem with Samsung is, and Samsung's well in with the OpenRAN movement itself. I mean, it's one of the companies that's actually got.
Well, it's big enough to
claims
be
to
able
have
to
compatible
do it
kit.
either way.
The trouble with Samsung in Western Europe certainly is, we were talking earlier about single RAN, having a hardware product where 2G, 3G and 4G all sits on the same thing. You have to take that out and replace it with
They're
something.
basically a new entrant to the RAN.
You need a company that can also support 2G and 3G. Those technologies, I mean, 3G is not so important anymore. It's being switched off, I think, in the next year by a lot of operators. But 2G is widely used still for roaming, M2M. You can't, 2G is going to be here for quite a long time.
M2M,
Yeah.
that's one I haven't heard for a while.
Well, that's what
That's a
IoT
retro,
is, isn't it?
That's a retro term.
Yeah. but,
Machine to machine, in case
yeah.
anyone is not as old as us.
So they need, and Samsung just doesn't have those capabilities. So
No,
they,
it makes you wonder. So we briefly mentioned Mavenir buying whatchamacallit, IP access. Makes you wonder why Samsung hasn't just gone off and bought someone that can fill that hole for them.
But I think maybe that Samsung is just not enough.
Not that bothered.
Yeah, I mean they've got enough markets that they can still go into. They just picked up this massive deal in America with Verizon. Now, my impression is that America's not. It doesn't look the same in terms of this sort of single RAN dependency, and certainly Huawei's never been there, and it's just a different setup entirely. So, they've got a big presence in South Korea. They've got, they have markets where they're doing well, and maybe they think that they can. There's enough low hanging fruit maybe for them to grab in some of these regions and. and a bit in Europe. And
Well,
then
you mentioned South Korea, and it's not surprised that Samsung does well in South Korea because it's South Korean.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. Yeah, I'm not going to go. We certainly haven't got enough time to go down this rabbit hole now. But back to what we're talking about with China and the geopolitical stuff. There's definitely a massive direction of travel in favour of nationalism, in terms of balkanization, in terms of finding domestic champions.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to be self-reliant. And I think that's what's fundamentally, from a political point of view, driving OpenRAN.
Do you know one thing that could happen?
Yeah.
That I've just thought? Samsung buys parallel wireless.
Right.
Because that would give...
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah. What do we get if he's right?
Because I think there's been speculation anyway for a while that if the if the Open RAN companies themselves become enough of a threat, that the big vendors could just go out and try and acquire them. Yeah.
Yes.
You remove a rival, and you also get its expertise in a particular area. I mean, this always happens. It happens in the online world.
That's how big companies work.
What Samsung? Why would it do that? Because it needs... Parallel wireless has something Samsung needs, which is 2G and 3G expertise, in the same way that Mavenir bought IP access to get 2G and 3G expertise. It's obviously a much bigger company coming along and buying a relatively small player, but it would provide it perhaps with that capability that it needs to...
But then the fact that Mavenir's IPOing makes me wonder, presumably Mavenir's had chats with people who might buy it before it IPOs, and it wasn't happy with this is just a guess, but let's say before it IPO'd, it made sure that it wasn't just its exit strategy of just getting bought by a big company wasn't going to give it the value that it thinks it
Well, I think the trouble
deserves.
for them, though, is that, they don't have... So Mavenir didn't have 2G and 3G stuff before,
okay.
so there's not an obvious reason for Samsung to go... There's an obvious reason for Samsung to go and acquire. And Ericsson and Nokia... Everybody goes on about them being resistant to, well, maybe not Nokia so much, because they've actually gone on about Open RAN compatibility recently. But everybody comes out with this line that Ericsson's sort of anti-Open RAN, and I'm sure they do look at it and think, what does this mean for our business model of selling, all the products at a particular mobile site and doing very well out of that? Thank you very much. If you open it up, then other people can come along and it's more competitive and it's not great. But it's not as though they can't do it. They've got the capability to do Open RAN stuff. Yeah. They've got the capability to open up those interfaces. Even. They don't need to have compatibility with O-RAN Alliance specs. They can just open the interfaces up. It's not as though Mavenir has anything that Ericsson lacks. It's just a thorn in the side because they're promoting this argument about, that the operators want to hear, we want open networks. So,
well, and one thing, unless you've got anything else that you want to add, I think we're on about an hour. One final thought on the Open RAN and the tip thing and the Vodafone thing. One purpose it serves in the short term, because as you've mentioned lots of times on the pod, Open RAN isn't necessarily weapons grade yet, or carrier grade, to be less flippant, is that every time Vodafone can go, look, we can just turn out a radio for £1,000, it's basically something that they could throw at Nokia and Ericsson and go, how come you're charging us 10 grand when we can do this for £1,000? Obviously, it's not as simple as that. Presumably, whatever they've managed to turn around for £1,000 is not equivalent.
They'll just say it's a.
But it's
like
still
buying your clothes at Primark instead of
what you're trying to say. But it's still the point is, it's a form of manufacturing competitive pressure where it's not there. So right now, it's a duopoly with Huawei being kicked back into China. So there's a duopoly, and if I was an operator, I wouldn't want to be in a position of duopoly. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that there's any collusion between Nokia and Ericsson, but it's easy to form a spontaneous cartel when there's only two of you.
Well, I think that's why these companies do have a role, and they will. I mean, operators want the main reason Open RAN will succeed is not because it's not. The main reason it will succeed is because operators want it. There's a lot of negative talk about Open RAN. There's a lot of analysts you can talk to. You go, oh, it's rubbish. It's not that capable. You need to have, the processors aren't. They come out with the same arguments that Ericsson does actually. That it just doesn't measure up performance-wise. Yeah. And they dismiss it and say that's why it's never going to work. The trouble is that the operators themselves have said we want this for strategic reasons, because we don't want to have a duopoly.
Putting a lot of effort
and that's
into
why I think these companies will have a role. And you see interesting moves like Rakuten buying Altiostar, having a majority stake in Altiostar, which is I talked to Altice Star this week, actually, to the head of strategy, and he was saying one of the reasons for that deal was to guard against a hostile takeover, sort of implying that there was a concern on Rakuten's part, it's building an Open RAN network. They didn't want to see it get sucked into one of the big vendors, perhaps,
Yes.
what we were just talking about.
To at least keep it autonomous.
You wouldn't want an Open RAN market where the only companies selling Open RAN kit are Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah,
You're no better
exactly.
off then, are you? So,
Which, if they were feeling a bit more flush with cash and their share price was a bit higher, they probably would have gone acquisition spree already.
yeah.
Okay, should we wrap it up then?
Let's wrap it up.
Cool.
Let's drink a bit more of this.
Yeah, well, I've done mine. I'm all right.
Yeah.
Guys, it's a bit Moorish. I could get
Very more. It's very
I
good.
could get in a lot of buffer
Yeah.
on this. You bad boy, Pierre. Cool. All right, well, we'll wrap it up there and I'll go off for my little birthday larks. Must remember to have a bite to eat and a glass of water. There we go. So thank you very much for listening and make sure you join us for the next one.